Good morning. Good to see you. Welcome back. Hard to believe we are on week 7 out of 10. That following week will be the Faithful Conference. I encourage you again to sign up for that. Carl Truman will be here and look forward to that. He'll be speaking Saturday night and then during the joint Sunday school class and then our Sunday services. We come this morning to the Crusades. Let me mention a few books. I tried to bring 2 or 3 books each time. I'm not a world's expert on any of these topics that we've been doing, but I try to read some primary sources and some good secondary sources, and perhaps if you want to learn more. So here's a few books. The Crusades is what we're really talking about this morning, a massive topic, as you can imagine. So there's lots of multi-volume works on the Crusades. Here's 3 single volumes. So this one's the biggest. The Crusades, the authoritative history of the war for the Holy Land. So if you want 750 pages, believe me, there's a lot more out there. I didn't read all of this, but I read the middle chunk that dealt with Richard the Lionheart, but this is good. And at a much more popular level, this may be the one that would be the easiest to read, by Rodney Stark. He just passed away not too long ago. He was a sociologist at Baylor, but he was a very good kind of popular level armchair historian who would read the sources and present things in a good digestible way. So this is his book, The Case for the Crusades. So if you want a case for the Crusades, why should we be more sympathetic to the Crusades? You can read Rodney Stark's book. This is about 250 pages. And the best volume that I've come across, and the one that I relied on most for this lecture, is this book by Thomas Madden. He is a historian of the Crusades, The New Concise History of the Crusades. So again, this is just under 250 pages and a little more academic than this one. But all 3 of these are good if you want to know more, but perhaps you don't. As I said last week, I am going to leave as close to 10 as I can, so I'm going to go over to the new members class, introduce myself there, but I'm not going to let you out early. That would be a shame. We have a wonderful substitute who's better than the original, Chad Van Dixhorn. Where are you, Chad? Chad just stood up somewhere, but he's coming back in, I promise. You may have met Chad and his family. Chad is the church history professor at RTS Charlotte, now that our very own Don Fortson has retired, and Chad and his family have been coming to church here, and they're in the new members class. Chad is ordained in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He really is the world's expert on the Westminster Assembly, but he's going to come up and do the last 15 minutes on a surprise person that we haven't talked about yet, but fits in this time period. So welcome Chad when he comes up at 10 o'clock. So the Crusades. Albert, you want to just grab these and just put them there by my bag so I don't forget them. The big one? Yeah. Thomas Asbridge. Yeah. You're going to go right for the big one, I know, Jonathan. Good for you. Yeah, and when the lectures come out on Clearly Reformed, Albert's putting a link to these books as they're mentioned. I first heard about Richard the Lionheart maybe in the same way that a few of you did. When I was a kid, watching the 1973 Disney version of the movie Robin Hood. Anyone remember that? It's old-style animation, says Buena Vista across the front of it, and they're all animals in this Robin Hood tale. And the movie begins with this prologue on the sort of the old script as the book page is turning. It says, long ago, good King Richard of England departed for the Holy Land on a great crusade. During his absence, Prince John, his greedy and treacherous brother, usurped the throne. Robin Hood was the people's only hope. He robbed from the rich to feed the poor. He was beloved by all the people of England. If you remember that, it's only about a 75-minute movie. One of my favorites has a kid with lots of good voice actors and good little songs. Richard doesn't make an appearance until the very end of the movie when Prince John and his snaky friend have been put into prison and Robin Hood and Maid Marian are getting married. And since it's a cartoon and all of the characters are animals, naturally Richard is a very stately, regal lion. And he shows up at the end. He's wearing a very demonstrable crusader garb with the crusader cross, and he's laughing it up with Friar Tuck, and he's got a sort of royal cane as he's there, wishing Robin Hood and Maid Marian well. I dare say that 50 years later, you would probably not see a crusading king depicted so favorably in a Disney movie. By the way, Robin Hood was probably a real person, though it's hard to know fact from fiction. The first known literary reference to Robin Hood and his merry men comes from 1377, and one early account of his life says that Robin Hood was born in 1160, so that does put him squarely in the time of Richard the Lionheart. In fact, one of those early stories says that Robin Hood was fighting with Richard the Lionheart in the Crusades, and when he returned to England, he found that his properties had been snatched up by whom? No, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Yes, the despicable sheriff. We say Nottingham, they say Nottingham. So Robin Hood existed, though we don't know how many of these stories are true. Back to Richard. Richard the First, as he would be known as the first Richard, King of England, was born in Oxford on September 8, 1157. His father was King Henry II. And his mother, very important, and there are biographies written of her, a very important person in her own right, Eleanor of Aquitaine, maybe? Yep, with the I. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived a very long life. She lived 1122, past Richard, to 1204. Eleanor married at first King Louis the Younger of France. So she was married first to the King of France, convenient, and then to the King of England. The marriage to King Louis the Younger never produced a male heir, and there were rumors that Eleanor had been unfaithful. By 1152, Eleanor and Louis wanted a divorce. Of course, you can't get a divorce, but they convinced the church that they should get an annulment because they had violated the laws of consanguinity, which means they were too close of relations. I forget if they were first or second cousins. That was fairly common at the time, but it allowed them a convenient out to have their marriage annulled. Almost immediately after the marriage was dissolved, Eleanor remarried. And I don't know if you women will appreciate this or not, but in quite the reversal of the medieval norms, she married a man much younger than herself, Henry, who was 12 years younger, so she was roughly 30 and he was 18. So went the other direction. Richard was born to this marriage. Richard was a Plantagenet. So one of the great families, most powerful dynastic families of the Middle Ages. In fact, Richard the First, you may remember this story from a number of years ago of Richard the Third. I remember this because I was doing my PhD work at the University of Leicester. I didn't live there, but I went back and forth a little bit, and it was big front page news around the world that they went to find the bones of Richard III, and they did all this research ahead of time, and they thought, it might actually be in the parking lot here of the cathedral in Leicester. And everyone says, that's never how archaeology works. You don't find it. Well, sure enough, that afternoon, the very first day, they found the bones of Richard III. So this would be a descendant later in this same dynasty. Richard was not in line to be king, for he had two older brothers. William died shortly before Richard was born, and then his older brother, another Henry, would eventually be supplanted. There's lots of drama, as often was the case with these medieval dynasties, of everyone jockeying for power, and usually your desire for power greatly trumped any loyalty you had to your family, and family marriages were often marriages of dynastic convenience, but eventually Richard supplants his younger brother Henry, defeats him in battle in 1189. It also helped that Richard was Eleanor's favorite child. They had, I think if I remember correctly, 8 children, Henry and Eleanor had 2 children from her previous marriage to the King of France. And in fact, in 1173, Henry, her husband, locked up his wife Eleanor. Now, locked up, it was probably fairly cushy, but it was under house arrest. For 16 years, he locked up his own wife until he died, until finally Richard, who will become king in 1189, and then he let his dear old mom finally out of her house arrest. Richard grew up in his mother's court in France. So Aquitaine is a landed gentry, nobility, aristocracy in France. In fact, except for being born in England, he was born in Oxford, and eventually becoming the King of England, Richard was, in almost no sense, English. He was, at least for many centuries, one of the great heroic kings of England, but he was much more French. His first language was a dialect of French, would have known Latin, but he probably never learned to speak English very well, and out of his 10 years as king, so you can do the math here, he was king for 10 years, he spent less than one of those years on English soil. So he didn't grow up in England, though he was born there, he hardly knew English, he hardly ever reigned in England. On September 3, 1189, Richard was crowned King of England in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey. But he would not stay there for long. For 2 years earlier, in 1187, Richard had made the most fateful decision of his life. He had received word that this mighty Muslim sultan, you've maybe heard of him, it's the most famous one from the Crusades, Saladin, as he's known to us in English. It's a longer Muslim name. But that Saladin was on the move through the Holy Land and had wreaked a great victory over the Christians in there's a lot of different words, the Holy Land. Sometimes people call it the Levant, which is a French term meaning rise, which goes back to sometime after the Crusades, but just refers to the land east of the Mediterranean. So today we would say Israel, Syria, up into Turkey, the Levant, or we can just call the Holy Land. He had received news of this great victory and the great defeat of the Christians in the Holy Land. And so hearing that Saladin was on the move, Richard took up the sign of the cross. It was a vow with great consequence, a vow to fight for the Holy Land. He's not yet king, and many people thought it was rather foolish of him. As we'll see as we go on, Richard had almost everything to lose by making this vow. Now, he did have glory to gain for himself, but he had almost everything in terms of earthly wealth and power to lose by vowing to fight in the Holy Land. And he was motivated, as the Crusaders probably were, by many different motivations, but certainly one of them was a sincere desire that in his medieval mind, what could be more important than to restore to the Christians the land where Christ once walked. So after taking time to raise the necessary funds, so it takes a lot of money to go and support a military effort half a world away, and you don't have communication like we do, you don't have transport like we do, but he was very successful at raising money. It's similar to at different times in American history where the U.S. government would sell bonds, and it was sort of an act of patriotism. Would you give to this cause? Well, they had something which came to be known as the Saladin tithe. So it was 10% of your wealth. So many poor people, of course, didn't have much to give, but the rich and the landed would give this Saladin tithe to help fill the coffers. And so Richard collected and amassed a wealth of resources in order to fund an army to head to the Middle East. He joined forces with King Philip Augustus of France, and they set sail. Well, they didn't set sail. They went at first by land for the Holy Land. Richard and his fleet of ships, 100 ships, arrived in June of 1191. Now, there was already a great crusader effort underway in the Holy Land. But when Richard and Philip, the kings, arrived, the King of France and the King of England, with their armies and their great resources, it was met with tremendous celebration. And as the kings of England and France fought alongside the Crusaders, the fate of the Christians quickly improved. And amazingly, Richard led the Crusaders in victories over the great Saladin at the Battle of Acre, A-C-R-E, then continuing down the Mediterranean coast toward Jerusalem, at the Battle of Arsuf, and then again at Jaffa. And after the siege of Acre, Philip decided he needed to return to France to attend to business there. Then all of the glory on the battlefield was left to Richard, and all of the commanding prowess was left to Richard as they made their way to Jerusalem. Now, much to the chagrin of his army, Richard never undertook an assault on Jerusalem. That was always the goal. And we'll back up in just a moment and try to explain where we are with these crusades. But in this third crusade, they were meaning to retake Jerusalem. And his men were just chomping at the bit, just ready to go in. And historians think, much to the loss of his own reputation, but probably wisely, he decided against an attack on Jerusalem. It was considered by many people the most impregnable fortress anywhere in the world, certainly in the known part of the Mediterranean world. Had great fortifications, and Richard could only foresee that they would go, and all the advances and the heroic victories they had won so far would be met with great defeat at Jerusalem. But of course, his men, and as word trickled back to Europe, they were greatly disappointed. This is the whole purpose, to come and take Jerusalem. He was also concerned, no doubt, about word that he had received what was happening back in England and France. More on that in a moment. So on September 2, 1192, so he arrives in June, now a year and some later, in September of 1192, Richard agrees to a treaty with Saladin that would at least allow Christian access to Jerusalem and allow Richard to keep many of the cities that they had conquered. One of the issues at various times, the Muslim empires that were in control of the Holy Land, some were more tolerant, some were very intolerant. And once the Turks took over from the Arabs, they often were less tolerant and would not allow Christian pilgrims. So that was a big deal. Even if this isn't a Christian land, we need to allow for Christian pilgrimage. When the Muslims were smart, they realized that if you don't allow pilgrims to come to Jerusalem, you're taking away its most valuable economic commodity. And that has continued to be true for 2,000 years, probably. So he at least allowed that there was access for the Christians back to Jerusalem. Richard was no doubt also concerned about what was happening back in Europe with that scurvy scalawag Prince John, his younger brother, who was scheming to take control of Richard's lands and make an alliance with France. You remember from the Disney movie, he's lying in bed, sucking his thumb as Robin Hood is on a pulley system, getting all the bags of ill-gotten money. I'm sure it happened just like that. So Richard sets out to return to England, but not so fast. There's a great adventure story we don't have time to tell. Just to get back to England, he's a wanted man. He's made a lot of enemies, not only in the East, but across Europe, because at various times he had no compunction about asserting himself as better and braver than these other dukes or kings throughout Europe. And so he was a wanted man. He had to travel back through Europe under disguise. Some accounts say his disguise would have been much better if he didn't wear lavish jewels and rings. And just think about it for a moment, you don't look like a regular person. But he makes his way until eventually he's captured by one of his longtime rivals, Duke Leopold of Austria. Richard was a captive for over a year, and during this time, they want a ransom. So, God bless your mother. Eleanor is still kicking and going strong, and she oversees a collection from the people to get enough of a ransom to release her son Richard from, again, some kind of house arrest from Duke Leopold of Austria. He's finally released in February of 1194, and on April 17, 1194, he's crowned as king for a second time, and he's able to do away with all of Prince John's treachery, vanquished his brother. His mom prompts him to forgive his brother, but he still has unfinished business with King Philip. So he's crowned a second time in 1194. You say, what about these other 5 years? Well, he's only in England for about another 10 days before he heads back to France, because he's got to sort things out with King Philip Augustus, this same king that he was fighting side by side with in the Crusades. Now they're fighting over all of their lands and all of their dynasties in France, and so he spends the next 5 years negotiating and fighting with King Philip. So he's hardly on English soil at all. During a siege in this time, in which Richard was trying to reclaim buried treasure that was found on one of his lands. Yes, there was buried treasure at times. And somebody else said it was their land. No, he said, no, Philip, you've taken my lands. So he went to try to recapture this land, and he got too close to the action, and he was struck with a bolt from a crossbow, and 10 days later he died of an infection on April 6, 1199. Only 42 years old. He ruled over England as Richard I for 10 years. He was called the Lionheart, of course, because of his great heroism and bravery in the Crusades. But later the story was also told, perhaps invented to give just more of a dramatic backstory, but it was told that when he was a young man, he once faced a lion face to face and killed him, and with his bare hands ripped out the still beating heart of the lion, and according to some sources, he also took a bite out of that heart. Ooh, Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionheart. For centuries after his death, Richard was hailed as a hero, the great conquering Crusader king who amazingly pushed back the advance of the amazing Saladin. He was considered in some sources another Alexander the Great, or with a Christian view, another Charlemagne. Now, not surprisingly, more recently, many consider Richard to be a terrible king. And you can find arguments that he was the best and indeed the worst king of England, who dealt cruelly with his enemies, who overtaxed his people, who left England neglected and in administrative disarray. Or was he the very best, who gave this medieval picture of Christian courage and chivalry and knighthood? Well, we'll come back to Richard before we end, but we need to widen our gaze and look more broadly for a bit at the Crusades themselves. It's a bit of a tease to say the lecture's about Richard the Lionheart. It is, but I also need to use that as an entree to talk about these things we call the Crusades. And I don't have to tell you, we live in days again, and it's always been like this, where there is great bloodshed over these lands. And the point of this lecture is certainly not to tell the Christians to go march and retake the land, but let's try to put ourselves not as 21st century folks living in America, but as medieval Christians. What were the Crusades? The Crusades, simply put, were a series of military expeditions over several centuries, from the First Crusade in 1096 through at least the Fifth Crusade in 1221, or if you want another date, you could say the end of the Crusader kingdoms in 1291. And we'll go through these crusades briefly in just a moment. The term crusade, of course, that's an English word. That was not a medieval word. It comes from cruce signati, meaning those signed by the cross. It's a term used occasionally after the 12th century to refer to what we call crusaders. So they were referred to. Those who signed themselves with the cross, like Richard did when he made a vow, signed himself with the cross, maybe initially this kind of sign, but then the paraphernalia, the regalia of the cross to go to the Holy Land, those signed by the cross. Contrary to popular opinion, the Crusades did not begin as a holy war whose mission was to convert the heathen by the sword, though there were unfortunately some instances of that. In fact, very few of the Crusaders saw their mission as an evangelistic one. The initial purpose of the Crusades and the main driving military goal through these 200 years, and you can stretch the Crusades all the way up into the 15th century up until the Reformation by some reasonable definition. But the main goal was quite simply to reclaim Christian lands conquered by Muslim armies. When Muhammad was born in 570, again, if I were on top of things, I'd give you a nice map, but you know I'm a very good map artist. There's the Mediterranean Sea. And, Spain comes down and Africa comes up, and you have, Israel over here, and you got the boot, and you got the idea. When Muhammad was born, Christendom surrounded the whole Mediterranean world, from the Middle East down all the way into Babylon or Iraq today, parts of Iran, the Persian world, across North Africa, up into Europe, almost all the way over to Spain. That whole realm, which of course had been the Roman Empire, was, we might call, Christendom. Within a few generations, just maybe 75 years after Muhammad's death, the Muslim Empire had swallowed up almost all of Spain, all of North Africa, several islands in the Mediterranean, and almost everything in the Middle East. Over here you have Turkey, and here you have, we'll say, Constantinople. So it was amazing in such a short period of time how much of the old Roman Empire, how much of Christendom had contracted. And we saw a few weeks ago with Charlemagne, if it had not been for Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, if he had not been victorious over here, my map's bad, in the Battle of Tours, in the 730s, driving out the Muslim advance here, they might have made their way into Western Europe. And then there are two very important attempts, one in the 670s and then one in the 710s, where Muslims laid siege to Constantinople. And in both times, the Byzantines were victorious. And many historians, especially the second siege of Constantinople, consider this maybe the biggest what if of all of history. Meaning, if the Muslim armies had been victorious, either here in the 730s and coming across Western Europe, or here laying siege to Constantinople and sweeping across Europe this way, it's quite possible none of us are speaking English. Now, in God's providence, some would be Christians, but just from a historical what if, that Europe becomes Muslim, America is Muslim. I mean, it is a remarkable what if Byzantium here and Charles the Martel and the Frankish army here had not turned away the Muslim advance, because it seemed at that time that they were victorious wherever they went. Charlemagne, it's true, did force some pagan peoples to become Christians under point of death, especially there in Germany among the Saxons. But for the most part, recall, just trying to think as these Christians in the Middle Ages, they thought of this whole Roman world as now the Christian world. After all, they had not won the Roman Empire mainly by sword, but by the slow work of planting churches and leaders being converted and then favoring the Christians and monasteries and churches populating throughout the Mediterranean world. Remember when Charlemagne is crowned on Christmas Day 800, they crown him as the Roman emperor. And there hadn't been a Roman emperor in the West since the 400s. And there still was considered a Roman emperor here in Constantinople. So they have this long cultural memory, and in their minds, this is their world. This is Christendom. They still think of themselves in some ways, important ways, as Romans. This is still called here in the middle the Holy Roman Empire. And so if Christianity had conquered the Roman world, and now Islam was conquering Christendom, how could you not go as an act of great bravery to retake these lands for the Christians? Bernard and others, remember Bernard from last week, the great preacher of the Second Crusade, would give these very moving speeches. What will you say when you meet God on that day and he asks what you did for him and you had the opportunity to go reclaim Christian lands and you refuse to give of your wealth or of your children or of your very self? They thought of it as coming to the rescue of their Eastern brethren over here and reconquering the lands. So there was a whole effort for centuries to reconquer, and eventually they did, Spain, and then this was the most important objective, to reconquer the Holy Land. And I said these two sieges were unsuccessful, but if you remember some history, finally in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. And that's amazing because that's 2,206 years of some kind of Roman state. 753, right? 2,206 years of some kind of Roman state in the world. And then it falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But back here in the Middle Ages, they were eager to go and to reclaim this land that they thought had been wrongly taken over by Muslims. As many as 1,500 Europeans traveled to the Middle East during the First Crusade. But let's not think of 150,000 as a vast army. In those days, 20,000, 15,000 would have been a very large army. This was not an army of 100,000 people. It was a loosely organized group of people all moving in the same direction with a generally similar goal. But this movement of 100,000 or more people from Europe to the East was an amalgamation of some trained soldiers, clergy, servants, families, children. I do have to say, to be fair, there are also many records that there were groups of women, traveling prostitutes, who traveled with the armies to provide what male soldiers think they want during those times. But there were 100,000 or more during the First Crusade who went for various reasons. Some certainly went for their own glory. Some were ne'er-do-wells and were ready to go wreak havoc somewhere else. Many went at the promise of penance and forgiveness. And no doubt, if we take them at face value, most crusaders marched toward Jerusalem out of some sense of religious pride, conviction, and enthusiasm. Yes, some of the crusaders were crude and savage, and we'll come to that, but many were pious and idealistic. And it's true that most of them thought of themselves as pilgrims more than warriors. They thought of themselves on a holy pilgrimage, and they believed that God would be with them as pilgrims into the Holy Land to drive out the infidel. Traditionally, the Crusades have been taught with just a convenient formula, and there's lots of different ways to do this, but by a numbered crusades, at least 5 of them. So we'll have to do this very quickly. Let's do the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and there's some others along the way. So the first, in 1096 to 1099, we talked about a few weeks ago, summoned by Pope Urban II in response to a desperate cry for help from the East. Peter the Hermit is the most famous preacher of the First Crusade, and against all odds, the Crusade succeeds in capturing Jerusalem and setting up several Crusader states. What do I mean by Crusader states? Well, they're sort of feudal enclaves over there in the Holy Land. There were 4 of them. One, the county of Edessa. This is moving sort of from Syria down south. Then the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and finally the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So these 4 Crusader states were established during this first crusade. The second crusade, again, there's many different ways to give these dates. 1147 to 1149. We heard of this last week. Bernard's crusade. It ended in abject failure. Bernard and the rest of the church concluded the only reason that God would give us over to our enemies is that we must be impure, unholy. The Crusaders must have been impious, insincere. God had judged them and handed them over. They met with great defeat. Then the third crusade, which is where we have been today and where Richard the Lionheart was active. The West was stirred to action because they heard of Saladin's great victories in the East. And then after Philip and Richard arrive, the tide is turned, but they don't take Jerusalem. And we'll come back to Richard at the end in just a moment. The Fourth Crusade, roughly 1202 to 1204. An army from the West tried to install a new emperor in Constantinople. This is one of the saddest instances in the Crusades, and there are many sad occasions here. Constantinople, remember, is the greatest Christian city in the world. You could have comfortably fit the 10 largest cities in Western Europe within the walls of Constantinople. And the Crusaders from the Latin West come, and they think they'll be met by great triumph because they're putting in what they think is the rightful emperor in the East. But the people in Constantinople kind of shrug their shoulders and say, who are these people? They're kind of annoying. We didn't ask for them to come. And eventually, the Crusaders from the West sack Constantinople. They behave terribly once inside. Even the Pope acknowledges that those who were supposed to use their swords against the infidels used them against other Christians. The troops from the West looted, pillaged, fornicated. And the Byzantines felt betrayed, and some argue that they live with that same sense of bitterness against the Latin West. Some may even today. There is, in between the Fourth and the Fifth Crusade, something called the Children's Crusade. A young man named Nicholas from Cologne believed he was called by God to liberate Jerusalem. And he amassed quite a following. He and his followers marched through town to town, recruiting volunteers, and all sorts of people joined them. Not just children, but some children, why it's called the Children's Crusade, but young adults, teenagers, women, the elderly, the poor, local clergy. They believed that like Moses, God would open the sea to them and they'd be able to walk straight across dry land all the way to Jerusalem. But of course, the sea never did open for them. And on the way, they were tricked at one of the ports and said, we have safe passage to the Holy Land. But it was an enslaver who then shipped many of these children off into slavery. The whole ordeal ended in unmitigated disaster. The fortunate ones just turned around and returned home, but others died, others were sold into slavery. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, Crusaders capture the Egyptian port city of Damietta only to lose it again. Following this Fifth Crusade, there's the Crusades of Frederick II, who fails in Egypt, so the Crusades now turn south to Egypt, but he manages to negotiate the recovery of Jerusalem. This is sort of an interesting vignette because it shows us how different their world was from our world. Frederick negotiated a peace with the Muslim armies that basically established that Jerusalem would be almost like a kind of secular, non-religious city. The Christians would be the nominal rulers of the city, but the Muslims would be able to freely worship and govern themselves. And Frederick agreed that he would never raise the fortifications of Jerusalem, so kind of saying, we won't defend ourselves. And Frederick said, I won't get involved in any Muslim-Christian conflict, so we'll be neutral, we'll be Switzerland. From our vantage point, as modern people or late modern people, we might say, wow, that was tolerant, you found a peaceful solution. But the Christians and even the Muslims, many of them found it a deep betrayal. What do you mean? Religion now in the holy city is so unimportant that Christians and Muslims are just living together? And I'm not saying that that's the way we should look at the world, but just trying to understand how they saw it. They thought an agreement like this between a Christian emperor and a Muslim sultan was a disgrace. It looks like tolerance to us. It looked like treason to them. Following these crusades, you have the Crusades of St. Louis, from which we get St. Louis, of the 1240s and 50s and 1270s, ultimately ended in failure as well. The last Crusader states, as I said, fell in 1291. That was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Many people blamed the military orders. Remember, we saw last week that Bernard had begun the Knights Templar. The other most famous one are the Knights Hospitalier. Both of these groups had become very wealthy. In fact, the Knights Templar, in raising funds for the Crusades, had become like wealthy bankers all across Europe. Many people say, well, they're the first, like Lloyd's of London, or I guess that's insurance or banking, but they were the first great banking system across Europe. Well, once the Crusades fail, you have to blame someone. That's how it works. And these two groups were convenient to blame. Well, you are the knights who were supposed to be invincible, and look all around us. You're fabulous. You just got wealthy off of this, and then you failed us. And so they turn on the Knights Templar. Philip IV of France in 1307 orders all the knights to be arrested. Many of them are forced to confess to trumped-up charges of black magic, sodomy, heresy. Those who refuse are burned at the stake, and they're pretty much wiped out by 1314. The Knights Hospitaliers fare a bit better, because when they're kicked out of the Holy Land, instead of going all the way back to Europe, they go to the island of Rhodes, and then later to the island of Malta, and this group continues today, and they are known as the Knights of Malta. So let's bring this to a close with more information than I can get through here. How should we assess these crusades? Rodney Stark, in that book I mentioned, God's Battalions, mentions at the beginning a litany of voices who have given an overwhelming negative assessment of the Crusades. In 1999, the New York Times compared the Crusades to Hitler's atrocities, always a convenient comparison. That same year, many Protestants marched throughout Europe, from Germany to the Holy Land, wearing T-shirts with the message, "I apologize," so they could go apologize for the Crusades. Some of you may remember, this was popular when I was just starting in ministry, Donald Miller's book, Blue Like Jazz, and he talked about at various Christian, not Christian, but just college campuses, they would set up confessional booths, and when people came and said, "What's this about? Am I supposed to confess my sins?" There would be Christians there who'd say, "No, we want to confess our sins to you." And one of the chief sins would say, "We want to confess the sins of the Crusades." This actually had spread I remember one Sunday afternoon after church seeing this at Michigan State's campus. And I think I said something like, you're really confessing sins that you don't think you had anything to do with. It's rather convenient to confess someone else's sins. And I think I tried to encourage them, could you just try to read maybe one book, just one short book. They didn't have Wikipedia yet, just one short book about the Crusades. And then you can decide how and what you want to apologize for. Not surprisingly, during the Enlightenment is where a lot of this changed. Voltaire called the Crusades an epidemic of fury which lasted for 200 years. David Hume said they were the most signal and most durable monument to human folly yet to appear in any age. Diderot called the Crusades a time of deepest darkness and greatest folly. The popular conception, barbaric, ignorant, superstitious crusaders attacking peaceful, sophisticated Muslims, comes largely from Sir Walter Scott's novel from the 19th century, The Talisman, and Stephen Runciman's 3-volume history of the Crusades from the 1950s. In that important work, the author sums up with this famous line, quote, "The Holy War itself was nothing more than a long act of intolerance in the name of God, which is the sin against the Holy Ghost." And that was summarized for many people the Crusades. So might there be reason to have a slightly different impression of the Crusades? Now you can find any bad example you want to find. The Windish Crusade up with the pagans in Europe during the time of Bernard, yes, it was convert or die. Sometimes the Jews were persecuted, though sometimes Christians like Bernard tried to protect them. Richard, most infamously, had 2,000 Muslim prisoners slaughtered. And from our vantage point, that would be the great black mark against him. From his mindset, he was only doing what Saladin had done back in 1187. Saladin had 2,000 Christian prisoners. And even the Muslim chroniclers tell us this, that he allowed his Sufis and his scholars one by one to take as many Christians as they wanted and to slaughter them and to behead them. So Richard would have thought, one, how am I going to feed and transport 2,000 prisoners? And two, am I not doing simply what Saladin did to our men? We don't have to excuse it, we just have to try to understand. Many crusaders were knights and families who left their lands and titles behind. Richard was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in Europe. He had almost nothing to gain in terms of land and money by volunteering for the Crusades. He had almost everything to lose. So we are right, certainly, to deplore the cruelty meted out by many crusading Christians. But we should not ignore the plight and what motivated them. Christian lands had been conquered. They thought, surely this cannot stand. If Canada invaded Montana and North Dakota and Minnesota, somebody would say, we have to go. These are our lands. They would try to take them back. Here's a poem from the 15th century which captures well the heartbeat of the crusading spirit. Our faith was strong in the Orient. It ruled in all of Asia, in Moorish lands and Africa. But now for us these lands are gone. 'Twould even grieve the hardest stone. We perish sleeping one and all. The wolf has come into the stall and steals the holy church's sheep, the while the shepherd lies asleep. 4 sisters of our church you find. They're of the patriarchic kind: Constantinople, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antiochia. But they've been forfeited and sacked, and soon the head will be attacked. Give something of their mindset and why they undertook what they did. We should also resist the temptation to blame Muslim extremism today on the Crusades, because the reality is, until maybe the 19th century, the Muslims didn't care much about the Crusades. Why? Because they won. When you're the Yankees beating everyone, you just know you're on top. You don't get bent out of shape by the people who, beat you the first 2 games, and I know the Yankees aren't in the playoffs this year, and you come back and you win the World Series. You just remember you won. So it wasn't until parts of Western Europe begin colonizing parts of the Muslim world, and they bring to them, especially the French, bring to them these great stories of French heroes and crusading kings, that the Muslims say, wait a minute, I don't think we like this very much. So it does loom large in the Muslim mindset for some today, but that's a fairly recent phenomenon. So let me close here with a paragraph from Thomas Madden, who wrote that concise history of the Crusades. The point is not to make us fans of the Crusades, this is me here, but to make us more careful in understanding them. We fight for nation states and democracy. They fought for religion and holy lands. Their reasons for war seem wrong to us, and you can be sure that our reasons for war would have seemed utterly ridiculous to them. Here's what Thomas Madden says, quote, "It is easy enough for modern people to dismiss the Crusades as morally repugnant and cynically evil. Such judgments, however, tell us more about the observer than the observed. They are based on uniquely modern and therefore Western values. If from the safety of our modern world we are quick to condemn the medieval crusader, we should be mindful that he would be just as quick to condemn us. Our infinitely more destructive wars, waged for the sake of political and social ideologies, would, in his opinion, be lamentable wastes of human life." In both societies, the medieval and the modern, people fight for what is most dear to them. That is the fact of human nature that is not so changeable. So we don't have to agree with everything about the Crusades. Surely we cannot, and we must denounce the evils that were done at many times. And yet, medieval Europe understood themselves to be Christian, and they understood their errand to be one to reclaim Christian lands. Rodney Stark, the last paragraph of his book, the Crusades were not unprovoked. They were not the first round of European colonialism. They were not conducted for land, loot, or converts. The Crusaders were not barbarians who victimized cultivated Muslims. They sincerely believed they served in God's battalions. So whether we agree, and certainly we have some reasons to disagree, we should at least try to understand why they did what they did. Chad is here. He's got 15 minutes until 12, don't do that, 10:20 to fill in the gap. So let's welcome Chad, and we'll see you next week.